The airport was a symphony of motion. Luggage wheels hummed against the polished floors, interspersed with the chatter of announcements over the intercom. People moved purposefully, eyes fixed on their gates, their phones, or their families. Colonel Ethan Brooks sat quietly by gate 14, his military duffel resting at his feet, a contrast to the sleek carry-ons rolling past him. His uniform, crisp even after a full day of travel, drew a few glances, but he barely noticed. He had grown accustomed to the subtle weight of others' expectations and assumptions. Ethan was a man of precision, a trait honed over 2 decades in the Air Force. He had seen the world from the cockpit of fighter jets, where the vast expanse of the sky offered clarity that life on the ground rarely did. Here, in the chaos of the terminal, clarity was harder to find. Across the aisle, an elderly woman in a wheelchair sat quietly. Her hands clutched a small handbag, the only thing she seemed to have brought with her. Her gaze darted nervously from one airline employee to another, as if trying to catch their attention without disturbing them. She needed help boarding, that much was clear. Yet the staff, busy with their tasks and perhaps her lack of insistence, overlooked her. Ethan noticed. It was a familiar scene. Not dramatic, not overtly cruel, but familiar. The kind of neglect that wasn't malicious but insidious in its consistency. The kind that said, "You're not a priority." Ethan stood, his movements measured, and walked over to her. "Ma'am, do you need some assistance?" His voice was calm, even, carrying the weight of quiet authority. Her eyes lit up with relief. "Oh, yes. Thank you, sir." They said someone would help. But, she trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward the counter where a cluster of employees were engaged in animated conversation. Ethan nodded. "I'll see what I can do." He approached the counter, his posture upright but non-confrontational. "Excuse me," he said to the nearest attendant. "This lady needs assistance boarding. Could someone?" The attendant, a young man barely out of his teens, glanced at Ethan and then at the woman. His expression flickered annoyance, perhaps, or discomfort before he nodded. "We'll get to her. We're short-staffed today." Ethan held the man's gaze for a moment longer than necessary. The statement wasn't untrue, but it felt insufficient. Still, he stepped back. It wasn't his job to argue. Not here, not now. As he returned to his seat, he noticed a few people watching him. A middle-aged man with a newspaper folded in his lap gave him a curt nod of approval. A younger woman with earbuds in shot him a fleeting look of curiosity before returning to her phone. The elderly woman mouthed a quiet, "Thank you." Ethan offered a slight smile and sat down. He didn't feel heroic. He felt tired of seeing the same patterns, of noticing what others ignored. The intercom crackled, announcing the start of boarding. Passengers surged toward the gate, their urgency almost palpable. The woman in the wheelchair remained seated, forgotten once again. Ethan's hand tightened around the strap of his duffel. This wasn't new. This wasn't shocking. It was just another day. Another airport. Another reminder that some people's needs were too easily dismissed. But as Ethan stood once more to ensure she wasn't left behind, he couldn't help but wonder how many others saw and chose not to act. And what did that silence say about the world they all shared? In the military, silence often meant discipline. Out here, it felt like surrender. The boarding line moved with the kind of order that only airports managed to enforce, simultaneously chaotic and rigidly controlled. Zone by zone, passengers shuffled forward, clutching their tickets like passports to another world. Ethan Brooks waited his turn, his broad shoulders making the crowded space feel narrower than it was. The elderly woman he had helped earlier was now being pushed toward the jet bridge by a flight attendant. A young woman whose distracted expression spoke volumes. Ethan watched as she struggled to navigate the wheelchair through the narrow aisle. He didn't step forward this time. He had done enough for now. Or so he told himself. The plane, as expected, was cramped. Rows of identical seats stretched endlessly, each occupied by someone with their own destination, their own story. Ethan found his seat in the middle of the cabin, near the wing. He stowed his duffel with practiced efficiency and sat down, folding his hands in his lap. The roar of the engines outside the window was oddly comforting, steady, predictable, unlike the currents of human interaction. Next to him, a man in his 50s adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. He glanced at Ethan, his eyes briefly catching on the uniform before darting away. Ethan gave a polite nod. But the man didn't return it. Instead, he turned his attention to his phone. His body language stiff, closed. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his mind drifting. Moments like this, in transit, often brought reflection. The uniform on his back had been a source of pride for years. A symbol of service and sacrifice. But it had also been a shield. A way to deflect the assumptions and biases that followed him through airports, restaurants, and hotel lobbies. People respected the rank, the medals, the polished boots. They didn't always respect the man. As the plane filled, he noticed the same patterns playing out. The flight attendants smiled warmly at certain passengers, a well-dressed businessman, a young couple with matching luggage. Others, like the elderly woman he had helped earlier, received perfunctory nods or no acknowledgement at all. It wasn't blatant. It never was. That's what made it so insidious. "Hey, you mind not leaning into my space?" The voice came from across the aisle, sharp enough to cut through Ethan's thoughts. He turned to see a younger man, early 30s, muscular, and casually dressed, glowering at the elderly woman in the wheelchair. She was seated by the window, her blanket slightly draped into the aisle. Her face flushed as she tried to gather it, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the boarding announcements. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't intervene. Not yet. He watched, waiting to see if anyone else would. But the man simply grumbled and turned back to his seat. And the flight attendants moved past without a glance. Ethan shifted in his seat, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. She gave him a small, apologetic smile, as if to say, "Don't worry about me, I'm used to it." The plane finally began its taxi to the runway. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the vibration of the engines fill the silence. This was how it always went. 100 small moments, each too minor to provoke outrage, but together forming an undeniable pattern. He thought of the times he'd felt it himself, the sideways glances, the hesitant service, the questions that lingered a second too long. He opened his eyes as the plane lifted off, the city shrinking below them. Beside him, the man in the tie had fallen asleep, his head tipped back and mouth slightly open. Across the aisle, the younger man scrolled through his phone, oblivious, and by the window, the elderly woman stared out at the clouds, her hands still clutching her blanket. Ethan exhaled, his breath steady, measured. He had faced enemies he could see, battles he could name. This wasn't one of them. This was a quieter fight. One fought in the unspoken moments and the spaces where people pretended not to notice. And it was everywhere. The flight attendants began their service, weaving through the narrow aisles with practiced ease. When they reached the elderly woman, they offered her a drink without meeting her eyes. She declined, her voice small, and they moved on. Ethan watched it all, his expression unreadable, but his mind turning. This wasn't new, it wasn't surprising, but it still felt wrong. When the attendant reached him, Ethan ordered a coffee, his tone polite. As she poured, her gaze flicked to the uniform and softened, her voice suddenly warm. "Thank you for your service, sir." Ethan nodded, offering a brief smile. He wondered if she would have said the same if he'd been wearing a sweatshirt and jeans instead. The coffee was hot, bitter, grounding. He sipped it slowly, the taste as steady as the sky outside. By the time the plane leveled out, the cabin had settled into the quiet hum of cruising altitude. Passengers read books, watched movies, or dozed off. Ethan glanced at the elderly woman again, noting the way she folded her hands in her lap, her shoulders slightly hunched. She seemed smaller now, her earlier relief replaced by the familiar weight of being overlooked. Ethan shifted in his seat, staring out at the endless expanse of clouds. The sun was setting, casting the horizon in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful, in its way, and yet, all he could think about was the ground they had left behind, where these patterns repeated endlessly. It was just another flight, just another day, and yet, it felt like so much more. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, a sound so constant it became background noise. The plane cruised at 30,000 feet, suspended between earth and sky. Ethan Brooks sat still, his gaze shifting between the book in his lap and the scene unfolding a few rows ahead. The elderly woman he had noticed earlier was struggling again. She had tried to press the call button, her frail hands fumbling with it, but no one had responded. Now, she was attempting to retrieve something from the overhead compartment. Her efforts were hesitant, cautious, like she knew she was asking for more attention than the world was willing to give her. Ethan leaned forward, his body tensing slightly, but he didn't move, not yet. He wanted to see if anyone else would. It wasn't an experiment, exactly more a test of his own growing suspicion. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes darting away as though avoiding a bright light. The flight attendants, busy handing out drinks and snacks, seemed unaware of her plight. Or perhaps they had chosen to be. After a long moment, Ethan stood. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, but his presence was hard to ignore. He reached the woman just as her hands faltered, the compartment door resisting her attempts to open it. "Allow me," he said softly, his voice calm, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. She looked up, startled, and then nodded. "Thank you," she murmured, her cheeks coloring with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. Ethan retrieved her bag and set it gently on her lap. She smiled, a fragile expression that seemed to carry an apology more than anything else. "I hate to be a bother," she said quietly. "You're not," Ethan replied, his tone firm but kind. He returned to his seat, the brief interaction settling into his mind like a pebble dropped into still water. Around him, passengers avoided looking at him directly, their collective discomfort palpable. He opened his book again but found it difficult to focus. It wasn't the woman's struggle that lingered in his thoughts, it was the silence around her. The quiet acquiescence of those who had watched and done nothing. He knew that silence too well. It was the same silence he had felt when his own needs, his own presence, had been deemed too inconvenient to acknowledge. The flight attendants resumed their service, their polished smiles and scripted politeness smoothing over the atmosphere. Ethan watched as they moved past him, their interactions varying subtly with each passenger. Some were met with warmth, others with mechanical efficiency. The differences were small, almost imperceptible, but they were there. When the attendant reached his row, her demeanor shifted. She noticed the uniform again, her smile brightening. "Would you like another coffee, sir?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, thank you." The coffee came quickly, served with the kind of deference that made him uncomfortable. He wondered, not for the first time, how different this exchange might have been if he weren't wearing his rank on his sleeve. If he were just another black man in a crowded cabin. The man seated next to him, the one who had ignored his earlier nod, suddenly seemed interested. "Military?" he asked, gesturing toward the uniform. Ethan glanced at him, then returned his focus to the coffee. "Yes." The man shifted in his seat. "Which branch?" "Air Force." "Ah," the man said, nodding as though that explained everything. He didn't ask any more questions. But his tone had changed. It was no longer indifferent, it carried a faint trace of respect. Ethan had encountered this before, the quick recalibration when someone realized he wasn't what they had assumed. It always left him wondering what exactly they had assumed in the first place. The turbulence came suddenly, a sharp jolt that caused the cabin to lurch. Passengers gasped, their hands gripping armrests and seat belts. The plane steadied just as quickly, but the tension lingered, a reminder of their vulnerability. Ethan sipped his coffee, unperturbed. He had flown through worse. Around him, the murmurs of unease quieted, replaced by the hum of the engines and the low chatter of passengers resuming their conversations. A few rows ahead, the younger man from earlier, the one who had snapped at the elderly woman, stood and flagged down an attendant. His voice was loud enough to carry. "Excuse me, but is there any way to get more space? This seat is ridiculous." The attendant smiled, but it was strained. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're at capacity today." The man huffed, his annoyance filling the cabin like static. "Figures," he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. "They pack us in like cattle and expect us to just deal with it." Ethan watched him, his expression unreadable. The man wasn't wrong, airplane cabins were cramped. Uncomfortable, but his frustration felt misplaced. Directed outward at those who had no power to change it. It reminded Ethan of how anger often worked. Indiscriminate. Finding targets wherever it could. The flight settled again. The turbulence receding into memory. Ethan leaned back in his seat. His thoughts drifting. He thought of the elderly woman, now quietly dozing by the window. And the man still grumbling to himself. He thought of the attendants. Overworked but complicit in their selective care. He thought of himself, sitting in the middle of it all. Observing but unsure if he had done enough. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling the approach of night. Outside the window, the sky was a deep indigo. The horizon glowing faintly where the sun had disappeared. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the engines lull him into a light doze. This was life at 30,000 feet, a microcosm of the world below. Its flaws and beauty compressed into a narrow metal tube. Ethan wondered if, when they landed, anyone would carry these moments with them, or if they would simply leave them behind, forgotten like the in-flight magazines stuffed into seat back pockets. The wheels touched down with a jolt. The cabin filling with the familiar chorus of seatbelts clicking open and phones buzzing back to life. Passengers leaned into the aisles, eager to disembark, their urgency a stark contrast to the stillness Ethan Brooks maintained in his seat. He waited, as he always did, for the rush to subside. The chaos at the end of a flight never appealed to him. The elderly woman, seated a few rows ahead, struggled to rise. She glanced around for assistance. Her movements tentative. This time, a flight attendant appeared, her smile polite but hurried. "Ma'am, please remain seated until we can bring a wheelchair for you." The woman nodded, her expression resigned. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, while the stream of passengers surged past her without so much as a glance. Ethan observed the scene quietly. The contrast between her stillness and the surrounding commotion was striking. A silent commentary on how easily some could be ignored in the pursuit of convenience. When the aisle cleared, Ethan stood and retrieved his duffel. As he passed the elderly woman, he paused. "Ma'am, would you like me to wait with you?" Her face softened, and she shook her head. "That's kind of you, but I'll be fine. Thank you for everything." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable, and continued toward the exit. The flight attendants at the door thanked him for his service. Their smiles automatic, their attention already shifting to the next passengers. Ethan offered a polite nod and stepped into the jet bridge. Blank. Blank. The terminal was alive with movement. Its polished floors reflecting hurried footsteps and the glow of departure boards. Ethan navigated the crowd with practiced ease, his tall frame giving him a slight advantage in the bustling sea of travelers. He wasn't in a hurry, he never was after a flight. The transition from the quiet of the sky to the noise of the ground always felt jarring. Like stepping into a different reality. As he approached the baggage claim, a voice called out behind him. "Colonel Brooks?" Ethan turned to see a woman in her early 30s. Her dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She held a notepad in one hand, a press badge clipped to her blazer. Her presence was composed, professional, but her eyes betrayed a hint of curiosity. "Yes," Ethan replied, his tone cautious but polite. "I'm Rebecca Carter," she said, extending her hand. "I'm a journalist with The Observer. I noticed what happened on the flight and was wondering if I could ask you a few questions." Ethan hesitated. "What exactly did you notice?" Rebecca smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "The way you stepped in to help that woman. And the way others didn't. It's something I've been researching, how implicit biases affect our everyday interactions. Especially in public spaces." Ethan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I was just helping someone who needed it. That's not a story." "Maybe not," Rebecca admitted, "but the context around it is. You might not think it's a big deal, but it reflects something bigger, how we see and treat each other in these shared spaces." Ethan exhaled, his gaze shifting to the carousel as the first bags began to emerge. He wasn't a man who sought attention, least of all for doing what he considered the bare minimum of decency. But something about Rebecca's persistence gave him pause. "I'm not sure I have anything worth saying," he said finally, "and even if I did, I'm not sure anyone would listen." Rebecca tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. You'd be surprised. Sometimes the most powerful stories come from the quietest voices. Ethan considered her words, the buzz of the terminal fading into the background. He thought of the elderly woman, her quiet dignity amidst the indifference she faced. He thought of the passengers who had looked away, and the flight attendants whose smiles had been so selectively warm. And he thought of his own silence, the way he had chosen observation over action so many times, telling himself it wasn't his place. Maybe, he said at last, his voice low, but not today. Rebecca nodded, her expression one of understanding rather than disappointment. If you change your mind, she said, handing him a business card. I think your perspective could make a difference. Ethan slipped the card into his pocket without looking at it. Safe travels, he said simply, then turned back to the carousel. Blank. Blank. By the time he retrieved his bag, the terminal had begun to empty. The crowd thinned, leaving behind the echoes of announcements and the occasional squeak of a luggage cart. Ethan stepped outside into the cool evening air, his breath visible in the fading light. The sky above was streaked with the last traces of daylight, the horizon a blend of deep blue and pale gold. He stood for a moment, his duffel slung over one shoulder, and let the stillness settle over him. The world below felt heavier than the sky above, its weight pressing against him in ways he couldn't always articulate. A shuttle bus pulled up, its doors hissing open, and Ethan climbed aboard. He took a seat by the window, watching as the terminal receded into the distance. He thought of Rebecca's words, of the small moments she wanted to amplify. He wasn't sure he believed in the power of stories to change the world, but he couldn't deny the unease that lingered in his chest. As the bus moved through the dimly lit streets, Ethan leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes. He didn't have answers, only questions, and the quiet nagging sense that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, was no longer enough. The quiet hum of the cafe offered a sharp contrast to the clamor of the airport. Ethan Brooks sat by the window, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. Outside, the streets of the city moved with their usual rhythm, cars inching forward in traffic, pedestrians navigating crosswalks, the ebb and flow of urban life continuing without pause. Across the table sat Rebecca Carter, her notepad open and pen poised. She had waited patiently for Ethan to call, and now she was here, ready to listen. I'm not sure why I agreed to this, Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of weariness. He hadn't worn his uniform today, opting instead for a plain button-down shirt and jeans, without the symbols of rank and service. He felt almost anonymous, which was both freeing and disconcerting. Because you care, Rebecca replied simply. She didn't press him, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Ethan took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. You said something the other day about context, about how small moments reflect bigger issues. I've been thinking about that. Rebecca nodded but didn't interrupt. She could sense he was choosing his words carefully, weighing each one before releasing it. The flight wasn't the first time I've seen someone ignored, Ethan continued, and it won't be the last. People don't think of it as cruelty, they think of it as neutrality. They tell themselves they're not part of the problem because they didn't cause it. But silence has a weight of its own. Rebecca jotted down a few notes but kept her gaze on him. Do you think that's why people avoid speaking up? Because they don't want to take on that weight? Ethan exhaled, his fingers tightening slightly around the coffee cup. Maybe. Or maybe they've convinced themselves it's not their responsibility. They're too busy, too tired, too focused on their own lives to notice what's happening around them. It's easier to look away than to look closer. He thought of the elderly woman on the flight, her quiet resilience in the face of neglect. He thought of the young man who had snapped at her, his frustration misplaced but unchecked. And he thought of himself, how often he had chosen observation over action, rationalizing it as pragmatism. It's not just about race, Ethan said after a moment. It's about who we see as deserving of attention, who gets prioritized and who gets left behind. Race is a part of it, sure, but so is age, disability, class. People want to believe the world is fair, so they tell themselves those who struggle must have done something to deserve it. It's easier than admitting the system is broken. Rebecca's pen moved quickly now, her notes forming a quiet rhythm against the page. "And what about you?" she asked. "Do you think you've done enough?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "No," he said finally. "I've done what's been expected of me. Sometimes more. But enough? No, there's always more to do." Rebecca set her pen down, her hands resting on the edge of the notepad. "That's why your voice matters. People respect you, Colonel Brooks. They'll listen to you." Ethan shook his head slightly. "People respect the uniform, the rank. Take that away, and I'm just another face in the crowd. That's exactly why it matters," Rebecca countered, her tone calm but firm. "Because you see it from both sides. You know what it's like to be seen and what it's like to be invisible. That perspective could open people's eyes." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. He watched as a man in a suit hurried past, nearly colliding with an elderly woman carrying a heavy bag. The man didn't pause, didn't acknowledge her struggle. The woman adjusted her grip and kept walking, her movements slow but determined. "It's not about being a hero," Rebecca said gently. "It's about helping people see the moments they've stopped noticing." Ethan remained silent, her words settling into the quiet spaces of his mind. He thought of the men and women he had served with, the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made. The clarity of the sky had always been easier to navigate than the murkiness of the ground. Up there, the enemy was visible, the mission defined. Down here, the lines were blurred, the battles quieter but no less important. "I'll think about it," he said at last, his voice low but steady. Rebecca smiled, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her face. "That's all I ask." They finished their coffee in silence, the weight of the conversation lingering between them. When they parted ways, Rebecca left with her notepad full of Ethan's reflections. And Ethan was left with something less tangible but equally heavy, the quiet realization that he couldn't remain a passive observer forever. As he stepped back onto the street, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement, Ethan felt the familiar pull of the sky. But for now, his feet remained firmly on the ground, and his thoughts stayed rooted in the world below. The air outside the courthouse was heavy, not with the threat of rain but with a quiet tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. A small crowd had gathered along the steps, holding signs that carried messages both firm and hopeful. Equal service for all. Dignity in the skies. See us. Hear us. The group was diverse, young, old, white, black, able-bodied, and disabled. They stood together, not shouting but holding their ground in peaceful solidarity. Ethan Brooks stood a few paces away, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't planned to be here today. In fact, he had told himself he wouldn't come. This wasn't his fight, not in any official capacity. And yet, something had drawn him here, a pull he couldn't quite explain, though he suspected it was the same instinct that had made him step forward on that plane. Rebecca Carter spotted him first. She approached with a calm confidence that Ethan had come to expect from her. Her notepad absent but her camera slung over one shoulder. "I wasn't sure if you'd show up," she said, her tone neutral, almost conversational. Ethan shrugged, his gaze fixed on the crowd. "I wasn't sure either. They're here because of you. You know," Rebecca continued, "your story made people pay attention." "My story?" Ethan turned to her, his expression skeptical. "All I did was point out something that shouldn't have been ignored in the first place." "That's the point," Rebecca replied. "Most people don't even do that. They see, but they don't act. You did." Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he let his eyes wander over the faces in the crowd. He recognized a few: Claire Davis, the flight attendant who had quietly helped the elderly woman despite the risk of reprimand; Marcus Bennett, the passenger whose initial criticism had given way to reluctant support. And there, at the center, was the elderly woman herself. She sat in her wheelchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her presence unassuming yet commanding. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up and smiled, a small but genuine expression that seemed to carry more weight than words ever could. Ethan nodded slightly in return, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Blank. Blank. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was quieter but no less charged. Ethan sat in the back, blending into the rows of observers as the proceedings began. The case wasn't about him. Not directly, but it echoed everything he had experienced and witnessed: the systemic neglect, the implicit biases, the invisible lines that separated who mattered from who didn't. The plaintiff's lawyer spoke first, outlining a pattern of discrimination not in grand, sweeping gestures but in the accumulation of small moments. A missed wheelchair request here, a dismissive tone there. Each instance, on its own, might seem insignificant, but together they formed a mosaic of exclusion. Ethan listened, his posture straight but his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He thought of the moments in his own life that had mirrored what the lawyer described. The times he had been overlooked, underestimated, or quietly dismissed. Not outright hostility, but a kind of erasure that felt, in some ways, even harder to fight. When Claire took the stand, her voice was steady but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edges of the podium. She spoke of the pressure to prioritize certain passengers over others. The subtle ways policies were enforced to favor convenience over care. It's not always intentional, she admitted, her voice soft but clear. But that doesn't mean it's not harmful. Her testimony was followed by others, passengers who had experienced similar neglect, employees who had wrestled with the same dilemmas. Each story added a layer to the case, painting a picture that was hard to ignore. Blank. Blank. Outside, the crowd had grown. More signs, more faces, more voices joined the silent protest. Ethan stepped out during a recess, needing a moment to clear his head. The sky was overcast now, the kind of gray that muted the world without silencing it. Colonel Brooks. The voice came from behind him, and he turned to see the elderly woman from the flight. She had been wheeled outside by a volunteer, but now she looked at Ethan with a quiet determination that belied her fragile frame. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Not just for what you did on the plane, but for being here. It matters." Ethan hesitated, then crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "I didn't do much," he said honestly. "You're the one who's here, standing up for what's right. We all have a part to play," she replied. "Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small, but it all matters." Her words stayed with him as the proceedings resumed, lingering in his mind like a quiet echo. By the end of the day, when the courthouse emptied and the crowd began to disperse, Ethan felt a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. Blank. That evening, as he sat alone in his small apartment, Ethan found Rebecca's business card tucked into his pocket. He turned it over in his hands, the weight of the day settling over him. He thought of the silent protests, the stories shared in court, and the woman's words, "We all have a part to play." Ethan picked up his phone and dialed the number on the card. When Rebecca answered, her voice calm but curious, he spoke without hesitation. "I think I'm ready to share my story," he said. The courtroom was unusually still. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but the kind of heavy quiet that comes when people are listening intently, waiting for words that might change something, not the world, perhaps, but at least the room they were in. Ethan Brooks stood at the witness stand, his posture straight, his hands resting lightly on the railing. His uniform, pressed and immaculate, lent him an air of authority, though he knew it wasn't the uniform they were listening to. It was him. He had spent the past few days debating whether this moment was worth it, whether his story could make a difference. But the faces he had seen, the elderly woman's quiet strength, Claire's hesitant courage, Rebecca's unwavering determination reminded him that some things weren't about certainty. They were about effort. He began speaking, his voice steady but measured. "I've served in the Air Force for over 20 years. I've flown missions in places most people only read about. And I've been responsible for decisions that carried immense weight. But nothing prepared me for the quiet battles I've faced on the ground." The room remained silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. "I've seen how people's perceptions can shift with a glance, how a uniform can command respect that might not be given to the person wearing it. I've watched as some are offered kindness without question while others are met with indifference or suspicion. It's not always overt, but it's there, in the small moments, the ones that are easy to overlook but impossible to ignore." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the room. On that flight, I saw a woman who deserved better. She wasn't asking for much, just the dignity of being seen and treated as a human being. And I saw how easy it was for others to look away. To convince themselves it wasn't their responsibility. I've done it myself. More times than I care to admit. Ethan's voice softened, but the steadiness remained. We tell ourselves these moments are too small to matter. That they're isolated, not part of a larger problem. But that's how these patterns continue, through silence. Through inaction. Through the belief that someone else will step in. He thought of the turbulence on the plane. The way it had jolted everyone out of their complacency. If only briefly. Sometimes, it takes turbulence to make us pay attention. To remind us that we're all in this together. That every person deserves to feel safe, valued, and seen. The lawyer for the plaintiff nodded, encouraging him to continue. Colonel Brooks, she said, her voice calm but clear. What do you hope will come from sharing your story today? Ethan took a breath, his gaze steady. I hope it makes people think. Not just about policies or training programs, though those are important, but about themselves. About how they move through the world. How they treat the people they encounter. Even in passing. It's easy to blame systems. But systems are made up of people. Change starts there. Blank. Underscore. Blank. After the hearing, Ethan stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. The crowd from earlier had thinned. But a few people lingered. Their conversations quiet but purposeful. Rebecca was among them, her camera slung over her shoulder. When she saw him, she approached, her expression thoughtful. You did well in there, she said. You said exactly what needed to be said. Ethan shook his head slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. I said what I could. Whether it changes anything, that's another matter. Rebecca studied him for a moment. You're not responsible for changing everything, Colonel. You're responsible for doing your part. And you've done that. He nodded, though the weight of the day still pressed on him. Change, he knew, was rarely swift or easy. It came in increments, in moments that built upon one another until they became something larger. Blank. Underscore. Blank. That evening, Ethan sat by his living room window. The city lights stretching out before him. He thought of the courtroom. The faces of those who had testified. And the stories they had shared. Each one was a thread. Part of a larger tapestry that had yet to be fully woven. He didn't know if his words would make a difference. But as he stared out at the horizon, he felt a quiet sense of resolve. Change might be slow, but it was possible. And sometimes, it started with something as simple and as powerful as a single voice breaking the silence. The airport felt different this time. Though Ethan Brooks wasn't sure why. The same sounds filled the terminal announcements echoing over the intercom. The rhythmic clatter of luggage wheels. The murmur of conversations. Yet, something beneath it all felt lighter. As though a subtle shift had taken place. One too small for most people to notice but significant enough to matter. Ethan sat in the same row of chairs by gate 14 where he had been months ago. His posture relaxed but his mind reflective. His military duffel rested at his feet. Its familiar weight grounding him. Around him, travelers bustled past, their faces a mix of focus and fatigue. Across the aisle, a flight attendant was speaking to a woman in a wheelchair. Ethan noticed the way the attendant knelt slightly to meet the woman's eye level. Her tone warm but professional. She confirmed the woman's needs before walking to the counter, where another attendant quickly stepped in to assist. The interaction was smooth, considerate, unremarkable in many ways. But remarkable in its normalcy. Ethan smiled faintly. It was a small thing. Barely a ripple, but it felt like progress. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The changes had been gradual. Almost imperceptible at first. After the court case, the airline had implemented new training programs, emphasizing the importance of equity and care for all passengers. Policies were updated, procedures refined. There had been pushback. Of course, change was rarely welcomed without resistance, but over time, the momentum had grown. Ethan had been reluctant to stay involved after the trial. He wasn't an activist by nature. Nor did he want to be. But Rebecca's persistence and Claire's quiet encouragement had drawn him back, reminding him that even small efforts could ripple outward. He had spoken at a few events, shared his experiences in interviews, and even joined a newly formed advisory board focused on improving accessibility in air travel. It wasn't his comfort zone, but it felt necessary. Now, sitting in the terminal, he could see the results not just in policies or procedures, but in people, the way staff moved with intention, the way passengers seemed more aware of one another. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was better. Blank, underscore, blank. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Colonel Brooks? Ethan turned to see the elderly woman from the flight months ago. She was seated in her wheelchair, a blanket folded neatly across her lap. Her smile was warm, her eyes bright with recognition. "It's good to see you again," she said, her voice steady. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." "I do," Ethan replied, standing to greet her. "How have you been?" "Better," she said with a nod. "Traveling has been easier lately. People seem to notice a little more now. And I hear you've had something to do with that." Ethan shrugged slightly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It wasn't just me." "Maybe not," she said, her gaze thoughtful, "but you were part of it. And sometimes that's enough." They spoke for a few more minutes, their conversation easy and unhurried. When it was time for her to board, Ethan watched as a flight attendant approached her with a genuine smile, ensuring she had everything she needed before guiding her toward the gate. The process was seamless, respectful, everything it should have been all along. Blank, underscore, blank. Later, as Ethan's own flight was called, he stood and slung his duffel over his shoulder. He moved toward the gate, his steps steady, his mind quiet. As he approached the jet bridge, he glanced back at the terminal one last time. The scene was ordinary, familiar, a snapshot of people coming and going, their lives intersecting briefly before moving on. But within the ordinary, he saw something extraordinary, the potential for change, the possibility of progress. As the plane ascended, the ground shrinking below, Ethan leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The hum of the engines was soothing, a reminder of the constancy of the sky. Up here, the world seemed simpler, its boundaries clearer, but Ethan knew the real work was on the ground, in the small, everyday moments where people chose to act or not. He didn't know where this journey would ultimately lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet sense of hope. Change wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping victories. It was about persistence, about seeing what others ignored and choosing to do something about it. It was about believing, even in the face of resistance, that better was possible. As the plane leveled out and the sun began to set, casting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan looked out the window and smiled. The sky, as always, was vast and open, full of possibilities. So, too, was the world below.